another episode of Thought Crimes, the podcast where no topics are off limits. If you or I or Jason were able to learn even one thing today, then I think we're on the right track. So, before we begin with today's topic, Jason, what's new in your life?
Man, there's a few things going on, but I gotta say, I am very excited for today's topic. This is one that's near and dear to my heart, and we've built so much of our knowledge off of it that I can't wait to get into it. But one thing I've been considering lately, it's the purchase of land, and it's going to tie very well into what we speak about today. But the community that I live in Atlantic Canada is growing very rapidly. And like many parts of the world, especially in Canada, you're seeing real estate prices rise quite a bit. You're seeing an exodus from the large metropolitan areas to the small and medium-sized cities. And it's in one of those areas that I find myself. And I'm trying to live strategically and think over my lifetime what's going to be some of the wiser moves I can make. And I'm thinking right now at the age where I'm at, purchasing land, even if it's out of town, a good half hour, something like that, a good amount of acreage that I'll be able to build upon down the road in maybe, say, 10 or 15 years. And I'm thinking that's going to have very good long-term value. And it's something I'm considering moving on there quite quickly.
Right. Yeah, we chatted about it yesterday, and it could be maybe potentially a partnership.
Yeah, no, there's definitely that possibility. And we'll get into it when we get into the fate of empire, but I very much see it as something that will pay dividends, maybe not monetary dividends, but at least security dividends down the road.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Owning land is seems to be a key investment, and again, not just monetarily.
Right.
And in fact, I think we alluded to it. Was it last week's episode? But I kind of mentioned, someone like Bill Gates buying up all the farmland in the U.S. I think he now owns the most farmland in the U.S. as an individual.
Right. And I mean, it's never wrong to follow the smart money. There's many people who just, hey, what did Warren Buffett buy today? Oh, okay, cool. I'll go buy that.
Apple? Yeah.
Exactly. And Bill Gates is going to be making apples.
Yeah, exactly. So you alluded to today's topic, and so today's topic you mentioned is Fate of Empires. And Fate of Empires is actually a little historical essay by a man. It was written by a man named Sir John Glubb. He had a pretty interesting life. So in a sec, I'm just going to kind of go quickly over his bio. He had a pretty worldly life. But towards the end of his life, in the 1970s, he wrote this small essay. It's only like 20 something pages, called "The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival." And he basically looks at any superpower or empire throughout history, anywhere on the globe, and tries to find patterns. So we're going to go through those patterns throughout the show. But just really quick, his life, pretty neat life. So I'm just going to read an excerpt here. John Bagot Glubb was born in 1897, his father being a regular officer in the Royal Engineers. At the age of 4, he left England for Mauritius, where his father was posted for a 3-year tour of duty. At the age of 10, he was sent to school for a year in Switzerland. These youthful travels may have opened his mind to the outside world at an early age. He entered the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich in September 1914 and was commissioned in the Royal Engineers in April 1915. He served throughout the First World War in France and Belgium, being wounded 3 times and awarded the Military Cross. In 1920, he volunteered for service in Iraq as a regular officer, but in 1926 resigned his commission and accepted an administrative post under the Iraq government. In 1930, however, he signed a contract to serve the Transjordan government, now Jordan. From 1939 to 1956, he commanded the famous Jordan Arab Legion, which was in reality the Jordan Army. Since his retirement, he has published 17 books, chiefly on the Middle East, and has lectured widely in Britain, the United States, and Europe. So later in his life, he wrote, I believe the exact date is 1976, he wrote this small essay called The Fate of Empires. Now, before I let Jason kind of take it away, with the substance of this piece. The main thesis of this piece is he makes the argument that we don't learn or teach history correctly. We look at history through too small, too specific of a lens. So we study a specific war, a specific people, a specific conflict or age, but we don't look at the larger picture. We don't take a holistic approach. So we don't look at all peoples. We don't look at throughout all ages. We don't look at throughout all conflicts. And this is kind of what he did, especially with his very geopolitical and military background. He looked at all of the empires, now today we could call them superpowers, the leading powers, leading nations or states at the time. And he basically finds the pattern that they are the leading power for about 200 to 250 years in their history. And eventually, for some reason or another, they seem to crumble. Now, those empires don't necessarily get completely destroyed or demolished, but they lose their, I guess you could say, their title or their prestige as the superpower, one of the superpowers of the globe. So how he looks at that, he actually divides an empire in several stages. So he divides it in, actually, it's 7 stages, I believe. So I'm just going to enumerate those, and then Jason, I'll let you run away with that. But stage 1 is called the outburst. Stage 2 is the age of conquest. Stage 3 is the age of commerce. Stage 4 is the age of affluence. Stage 5, the age of intellect. Stage 6, the age of decadence. And last but not least, stage 7, the age of decline and collapse. And towards the end, I'd like for Jason and I to discuss too what age we think we are currently in, whether we say Canada, the US, or the West in general. So lastly, I just want to say that his essay to us, we almost see it as almost prophetic. It's for just 20 some pages, it covers a lot. It's a very dense essay. Recommend that anyone read it and get a much better understanding, not only for history, but really for the cycle of empires and the trends of people. That's a really neat thing too. It's almost sociology work. And funny enough, it's Jason that introduced me to this. I'm the history major, but Jason was like, "Hey, have you ever read this, Fate of Empires?" And I hadn't, and I sat down and read it, and it was like, yeah, it's pretty bulletproof. Like for such a small essay, there's so much to learn from it. But all that to say, he wasn't the first to come up with this kind of cycle format or looking at the age of empires, at the how long a nation or a state can last. We had other thinkers, and one I just want to highlight before I give it over to Jason is a Scottish economist by the name of Alexander Tytler, who in 1787 was reported to have commented on the new American Republic. So he actually used the American Republic as an example of an empire that has a certain time limit, right? Now, instead of setting it in stages, identifying different stages throughout an empire, he actually created a circle, a cycle. And so I'm just going to go through the quick steps of the cycle, and then Jason, off to you. So the quick cycle actually starts with from bondage to moral certitude, from moral certitude to great courage, from great courage to liberty, liberty to abundance, abundance to selfishness, selfishness to complacency, complacency to apathy, apathy to dependency, and dependency back to bondage. So different way to categorize and look at it, but I'd say that there's a lot of similarities to Glubb's stages of empire. So with that said, Jason, over to you with stage 1, the outburst or the pioneering age.
Well, I'll tell you what, buddy, while you were reading through the stages that Tytler was espoused, I was following along on the stages of empire by Glubb, and they all match up exactly. However, Tytler has 9 stages, whereas Glubb has 7. And the last 3 of Tytler could easily all be combined into the 7th stage, or the age of decline and collapse. And especially when we get to that one there, you'll notice it's the one that has the most subdivisions and like little extras and ways you can look at it. One more thing I want to say about the essay before we get into it: it's remarkably apolitical, and it's also remarkably unbiased, if that's even possible today. No one culture is favored above another, and Glove goes to great lengths in many different areas of the essay to point out the fact that no one culture is superior to another. They just essentially all have their time in the sun, and a new empire will take aspects of an old empire and continue to move humanity forward until their time has been espoused.
Yeah, no, great observation. You could say it's like as objective as you could get, right? Because again, his entire thesis is to look at history through a much, much larger lens, through cultures, through times, through all empires, through all conflicts, which is something he's right that we don't do very well. Of
Right.
course, in history, you do have to specialize, but I think you would also agree that this could be a very good read to recommend to like all high school students.
For sure. I mean, this is almost like the sociology, the anthropology, the history, and the evolutionary psychology of humanity all rolled into one. It's an
Right.
incredible read. But let's get into it before we instead of
Well,
just
we nerd
saying how
out.
great this is. So, stage number one is an outburst. So, what is an outburst? It's a stage where a people that have been either traditionally repressed, impoverished, marginalized, with growing frustrations, come to a breaking point. And with a great amount of energy and really nothing to lose, just go. They open up and they expand and they revolt. They see an opportunity and they capitalize. It's characterized by great exploration, tremendous bravery, discovery, aggressive risk-taking action, improvisation. There's really little tradition. There's really little that's there's almost no conservatism at this point because there's nothing to conserve. It's we are moving outwards and we are taking because it's we we either feel protected by divinity or it's by necessity. Do you want to give an example of that, William?
Yeah, I guess one of my favorite examples. It's just a people and a man I studied quite a bit when I was a kid, just from my own personal interest, and that's Genghis Khan. If you look at the Mongol Empire, that's kind of what it was. It was a lot of very small individual tribes scattered across Mongolia, and because of a lot of actually infighting throughout the Mongol population, there was also the neighboring Chinese and peoples like that. But Genghis Khan eventually rose out of nowhere, right, and started either killing other tribes or assembling other tribes, and in a very, you could say, barbaric, blitzkrieg-esque fashion, took over massive, massive amounts of Asian land.
Right. Um, Stage one often leads directly into stage two unless the burgeoning empire gets thwarted by another power. And we do have an example of that we will get to. But the age of conquest is the second stage. And if you can imagine the outburst kind of like a gun being fired, the age of conquest is the bullet traveling through the air. It's moving at light speed, or I guess speed of sound, and it's just capturing territory. So the age of conquest, you're seeing a lot of organization, a lot of discipline. It's very practically oriented. There's not anything like universities or a lot of pop culture or intellectualism, that sort of thing. Everything is about duty and patriotism and expanding the territory.
Right. It's basically as if your outburst has now become organized, right? You're now governing an outburst, essentially.
Correct. One one example that I quite like of this, if we look at a stage one, stage two continuation, it's in the mid 1400s when the Spanish removed the Moorish Arabs from the Iberian Peninsula, the southern tip of Spain, back into northern Africa, therefore reconquering the entirety of Spain for the Spanish, if you want to call it that way. But that quickly moved into an age of conquest and exploration when Christopher Columbus sailed
Right.
across the Atlantic and discovered the Americas.
Yeah, it was actually the same year, I believe, that the last Moorish peoples were pushed out of Spain. The same year Spain sent Columbus out.
Exactly. And we know what happened from there. Greater and greater European presences were found on the American continent. And what did that lead to? That led directly into the third stage, the Age of Commerce. Now, the Age of Commerce is very similar to the Age of Conquest in its I guess its integrity and its soul and its drive. Whereas the Age of Conquest, now you're conquering land, you're bringing forward the empire, you're seeding the seeds. Now the Age of Commerce, you're taking that same patriotism, that same energy, but instead of your goal being more land, now it's to build up wealth, and you're going to see massive, massive explosions of commerce, wealth, trade throughout the new empire. And we saw that with the Spanish, the capital area got fabulously wealthy from bringing in the gold from the colonies. Now it doesn't mean that this was peaceful. It doesn't mean that it's all good. It doesn't mean that there's only winners and no losers in this. We are talking about conquering other peoples. We are talking about an empire being formed. So there is bloodshed. There is very, very bad times for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate on that, Will?
No, just it's part of the kind of objectivity that we mentioned with Glubb's essay, that it's not about saying who's good or bad, who's right or wrong, or looking at it through a, he wrote it in the 1970s. It wasn't about him looking at it in the 1970s thinking that he was smarter, better, and more moral than the folks that came before him or the empires that came before him. It was simply looking at these patterns. They happen, I'm going to describe them. And that's really what he did very well. So yeah, no, just good to stress that there are winners and losers throughout history, and throughout the animal kingdom, right? That's just kind of how it has always worked.
But the Age of Commerce does bring a lot more than just wealth. Often you'll see a unified system of government, often a unified language, a single set of laws being implemented across the territory of the empire. The best example of that is Rome, right? All you needed was
Right.
one passport, and you could trek from southern England all the way to
Yeah, Northern
yeah,
Africa,
northern Africa, Libya,
Syria.
Syria.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's what.
Yeah.
Ça, c'était le mot qui m'échappait.
Yeah.
A vast territory that spoke one common language. Of course, there were other languages present, but you had the common tongue, the common currency, and the common set of laws. And having that stability does offer people the chance to build edifices on top of, because you can't have a functioning economy if you don't have the bedrock of society to build that onto.
Right, and it ties in well to the episode, I guess 2 weeks ago, that we had, which was on bread and circuses, where we covered a little bit of the Roman Empire, and they had really started establishing massive trade to bring in grain, right, for the grain dole. So they would bring in grain from not only all over Italy but all over northern Africa into the capital of Rome to feed its poorest people. So again, there you see a lot of kind of systematic trade being organized throughout an empire.
And it's also very logical, right? Like if you put one thing that we didn't mention is that the time lapse of the empire, like you said, Williams, 200 to 250 years, but Glubb also puts it in terms of generations at
Right.
10 generations. So if you're in your age of commerce, you're most likely in generation 3, generation 4. Well, the people who started the outburst are now either very elderly or just on the doorsteps of the afterlife. But they're still there to transmit the values. They're still there to tell the stories. So the people within the age of commerce will still have those same values, or at least very similar values, to their grandparents and great grandparents who were around for the outburst in the age of conquest.
Right.
Now, what we see when we get to the next stage, the stage of affluence, is we start to see a bit of a shift. Everything up until stage 4 has been very energetic, very patriotic, very proud, and with a look towards the outside. What more can we do? What can we build? What can we create? What can we make happen? But because the territory has been conquered, because now there's affluence and commerce, what the age of affluence will do is it will start to weaken people's morals, because now there's fewer threats. There was nothing but threats in stage 1 and 2, and quite a bit in 3. But in stage 4, a lot of the external threats have been conquered. So this is when we see the empire at the height of its power. Is there stuff you want to talk about, Will, before I get deep into kind of the values and the morals and what we see within the age of affluence?
Yeah, well, just to add is you mentioned, the threat is like if you look at threat of dying, threat of violence, all that stuff. It's a lot bigger in stage 1 and 2, whether you're conquering or getting conquered, right? But and you mentioned that it still kind of bleeds into stage 3, the age of commerce, and you can think of still fairly recent things like folks that immigrated to the New World, right? I saw a stat the other day, and it was, I think it's 1 in 6 people. So way back, 17 or 1800s, if you were crossing the Atlantic to start a new life in North America, you had a 1 in 6 chance to die on the way over here, right? That's a pretty big risk for, I guess, the peaceful action of traveling, right? Something we take very much for granted today. We talk about the COVID stats and the COVID odds. Like, no, you left with your family to start completely anew, and you had a 1 in 6 chance of dying just from crossing the Atlantic.
And
right?
it's not like when you made it across that everything was well. Now it's okay.
No,
You're probably going to have
work.
to work your tail off for 10 years, and then but
and there's snow.
Exactly, and there's snow. One perfect example of that here in Moncton, there's a monument to the founding families, the 9 or 10 founding families right on the riverbank. And I was biking on the trail on the riverfront last summer, and I stopped at the monument to take the time to read it. It was in the 1700s that these, I believe, German and English families sailed across the Atlantic to Pennsylvania, where they worked in Pennsylvania for 10 to 12 years before just being able to pay off the cost of traversing the Atlantic. At that point, believe it or not, it was Benjamin Franklin who signed the deal to send these families up to Moncton, up the river, with a couple cattle and some basic hand tools, to drop them off to the riverbank and say, "All right, families, go. Start some farmland. Go make this happen." Like that is incredible bravery on their part. And one of the houses is still standing today, and you see it, and it's rickety. It's one of these old farmhouses, but it's a testament to the amount of energy and drive and willpower and strength and resilience of the people in ages of commerce and conquest had.
Absolutely. Something I think we all take for granted.
So to get back to the age of affluence, one thing that Glubb notes is that the best and the brightest are no longer motivated by honor and self-sacrifice. They're motivated by wealth, by accumulation, and their mindset goes from something looking outwards to a defensive mindset. How do I not lose what I've accumulated? And that's a key turning point in the outlook of the empire.
Hoarding.
Hoarding, but it's also, you're starting to see the seeds of selfishness being planted. And what's also happening is the mass of the wealth will always be centered in the metropolitan and the capital areas. So people will be attracted to these metropolitan areas. And Glubb speaks quite a bit on immigration. And again, immigration being a hot button issue today, Glubb takes a very objective and high level view at it. The way that he presents it is, he says the people who are immigrating to these capital areas are doing so for better opportunity, which is good. They see, is the example that you pointed out earlier, crossing to go to New York and starting lives there. However, one of the side effects of this is that since the seats of government tend to be in the capital areas, their decisions are going to start to be influenced by people not of the original culture. And this is when you're going to start to see social programs. This is where you're going to start to see safety nets. It's where you're going to start to see the erosion of the values that created the empire in the first place.
Hmm. And you see, Glove points it out too, is that where you see those changes first, or where I guess you see the age of affluence first, is always in capitals, right? Always in the super cities. So whether that's Rome back in the day, we mentioned the grain dole a few podcasts ago, that's a perfect example of kind of one of the first versions of a social safety net, right? Of food stamps, if you will, or welfare. So Rome's a good example. You had quite a few. Constantinople becomes one. London, New York, right?
One thing that's often marked in the Age of Affluence is when you see the grandest architecture of the civilization. So when you think of London and its cathedrals and the moments of its history when it was built, was often in an age of affluence.
Which I think we could all argue is the peak, right? Is partly the peak of that empire's lifespan.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
The next one is the Age of Intellect. So we're still running high, very, very much so, on the energy brought in by the Age of Commerce. So those systems are still in place. There's still commerce. There's still money being generated, but the the decadence of the mind, it really starts to accelerate in the Age of Intellect. And one of the markers here is that we think that the mind can solve all problems, that theory can solve all problems, and that action must only be undertaken after considerable amounts of evaluation. You see a lot less self-sacrifice. There's a lot less of that patriarchy. There's a patriarchal energy. There's a lot less of that go and do and conquer and build and make. This is also when you start to see universities pop up in every city center. And like I said, it's the stage where we think we're smarter than ourselves. We think we can figure it all out. One of the positives of the Age of Intellect, though, is that's often when you'll see the great scientific achievements and advancements of the civilization. Because now we have the material wealth, we have the comfort and the security, so we have the luxury to be able to tackle problems of greater magnitude and not of such immediate danger and necessity.
Right. No, very well put. All in all, that age is you start seeing a lot more thinking and a lot less doing, right? People become they're not doers
Exactly.
as much, at least.
And it's also when you start to see attacks on the old stock culture. So at this point, we're maybe five to seven generations in. So the original people who brought forth their values and their energies to initially lay the first stones of this empire have since deceased. And now the people transmitting their values are most likely the people from the Age of Affluence, when the mental shift had already started to happen. And I think that's really the brilliance of this essay, is you can almost put yourself in the shoes of any person at any point of the timeline and think, well, that person was acting logically. It makes sense to make those decisions given what was happening at the time.
Yeah, that's why coming from a more of a history background, one of my pet peeves in how to study history, especially when you do it with younger kids or even high school students, is kind of like, this person did that. What are your thoughts on that? Right. And it's just like you're imposing a whole set of values that you have today that are not at all relevant to the context of the person you're judging in history. Right. It just doesn't make sense. There's no value in it other than making yourself think you're greater morally, or you're holier than thou.
No, it's almost because you think that you came after that you have the moral high ground because you have the luxury of hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
And
Which
I
they
feel
had as well, right?
what's that?
Which they had as well. So
Absolutely. And I encourage anyone listening to really read the essay, because we're not so much digging into the examples as much as we're just talking about the overarching principles of each stage. And to really fully understand it and relate it today, I mean, you read this in an evening. It's 24 pages. It's very well worth it.
Another part too, he talks about. I think we miss it in the stage, but it's basically when you have more of that shift of less of the doing and more of the, transitioning more into the intellectual age, is that he actually specifically mentions masculinity, which is a very interesting highlight in the essay, which is something we can draw a parallel with today, where there's clearly an attack on masculinity, right? It is now toxic to act like a male, or what a male used to be or used to act like and look like now is seen as a pejorative. It's seen as toxic, and in fact, it's now in the APA as the American Psychological Association as a disorder. Right?
Can't have that now, testosterone. That's bad for you.
Right? No. So there's all these characteristics that are clearly tied to masculinity and boys, and behaviors that are clearly, 99% of the time, a kind of a boy behavior is now in the APA seen as negative, as a disorder,
right?
As pathologized, right?
And that's clear signs. And what I love about the example you just gave there is that it's been done before. We think everything is new. If you go through, I don't have all the examples off the top of my head. It's been a few weeks, few months since we've read this, but he makes numerous parallels to previous societies. And as we get here into the Age of Decadence, one really made me laugh. The Age of Decadence is marked by defensiveness, pessimism, materialism, frivolity, welfare, weakening of religion, feminism, all these sorts of things. Glubb made a parallel to, I believe, the 10th century, one of the Arab nations of the time, where bards were playing very loosely, songs with very loose sexual morals in the town square, and it was driving the young Arab women wild.
It was the WAP of their time.
It was the WAP of their time, exactly. So the patriarchs, or what was left of them anyways, shush the bards out of their cities, but in a couple months, a year at most, they would come back and start that little dance all over again.
Yeah. And rock and roll is another one, right? You had
exactly
rock and roll is the devil music, and
that's something we see a lot in the Age of Decadence, is the loosening of sexual morals. We saw it with Rome. One we didn't really see it with, I think, is the British Empire, but I'm thinking like Victorian. If Victorian society was the height of the British Empire,
right?
So the Age of Decadence would have been in the 1900s, give or take. But there's a couple world wars, so they had better things to do.
Yeah, exactly, and that's a thing we want to stress too, is that it's not bulletproof. But again, reading this kind of really opens your eyes, right? Makes you see history and understand this in whole new colors. But it doesn't mean that it's 100% bulletproof. And it also doesn't mean that every empire has the exact same timing of every age.
Right. It's more like road signs.
Yeah, it's almost spark notes to history.
And another one similar is pessimism. This is when you start to turn on your own culture. This is when you start to almost revile and hate the actions of the original stock, the original people of the empire, who went through the stages of outbursts, who went through the stages of conquest and commerce, that their actions were immoral, that was wrong. What they did to those other people was incorrect, and now we should pay reparations, or we should give back, or whatever it may be, instead of looking at it as an extension of humanity and a normal part of society and cycles. And of course, trying to make amends and build a just society for all, as just can be, but not at the expense of what actually created the society.
Mm-hmm.
Want to share an example or two there?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of where we're from, which is North America. We have, for the last several years, we've had some lots of talks and lots of canceling of our most famous politician, which was our first prime minister, the one who's credited with creating most of this nation, and that's Sir John A. Macdonald, right? So there's been a lot of talks and a lot of even cancellations of him, either like on names of schools, streets, statues, all of this stuff. And then you also have currently what's happening in the U.S. with the founding fathers, and even what's really funny is now the canceling of certain black leaders and certain leaders like Abraham Lincoln that were, pretty imperative in the freeing of the slaves, now also being canceled and destroyed. So it's a little mind boggling, but yeah,
Uh,
I'll leave it at that.
yeah, we'll leave it there. We'll let the listeners connect the dots. Another one is the welfare state. I mean, we're Canadian. We have a welfare state. We have a mixed society at best, where we do have some capitalism, but we also do have a vast amount of socialism. And Glubb does say that one of the markers of the welfare state is also the debasing of the currency, where your currency is going to lose value because of the excess printing of it. And that's actually how I stumbled upon the fate of empires. Is I was learning about investing, and I
Right.
was learning about the different asset classes, one of them being precious metals. And I stumbled onto the video series Hidden Secrets of Money by Mike Maloney. I believe it's a 9 or 10 part series now, but episode number 1 is essentially the cycle of empire, but completely related to finance, which is fantastically done. It's about half an hour, completely worth the watch. But it takes all of this and really looks at what was the monetary and fiscal policy through each of the stages and where are we today. And no surprise, Mike Maloney is saying that we're in the end stages. Not, spoiler alert. That's that's probably where we are in our society. And we can see with COVID, we could see with the talks for UBI and reparations and all these other policies that we're only expanding the currency supply, and we're expanding the reach of government into the financial, into the fiscal.
Hmm. Now, just before we get into the last stage, the age of decline and collapse, just back to what kind of uh, we were talking about. What I find interesting too, with when a population of an empire starts looking at its past, right, and starts criticizing it, wants to right its wrongs, whether it is justified or not. They just do, right. It's something they naturally seem to want to do in the stage of empire. But what we, if I'm looking at today, what we often see now in academia, right, in the age of intellect onward, is that we see this big rise in moral relativism, right? So essentially, who am I to judge another person's culture, or how they do that or did that, how they live their life, blah blah blah. Even if it's the antithesis of how we live our life with our laws and morals, right? So that I find that very ironic and very confusing, that a lot of the same people in the same movement are trying to completely cancel or destroy, I guess, the many people or cultures from the past, and often directly tied to those people, which is kind of funny, in the name of justice, progress, whatever you want to call it. But in the same breath, they'll push moral relativism. I find that very fascinating.
If you're looking for consistency on the left side of the aisle, I think you're looking in the wrong spot. I mean, this is also the same people who say that boys can choose to be girls, girls can choose to be boys, but we should give more scholarship to girls and we should hire more women into positions of power. So which one is it? Those are mutually exclusive. You can't have both. That means any CEO who's a male could just say he's a woman. But again, looking for consistency, you're not going to find it.
Right. Yeah. In fact, there's quite a few writings. I'm thinking of like Douglas Murray, for instance. He wrote his latest book is The Madness of Crowds, I believe. And he does mention that, because he's looked at history and a lot of social groups a lot, and what he points out too is that when people get obsessed with sexuality, like you mentioned, kind of the loosening of morals, but for him it was more of like a when people really start fixating on sexuality and things like that, it often coincides with the later ages of an empire.
Well, at the start, you really don't have that intellectual luxury, right? You're you have more pressing matters. And if you go through the stages, like from stage one, the outburst, there's no security, there's no safety. It's do or die, quite literally. Stage two, conquest, same thing, but except now you have momentum behind you. Stage three, okay, people probably won't kill us, and we're starting to accumulate wealth, but there's still stuff going on. So as you progress through the stages, life gets easier and better, but the humanity and the nature of people always seeking to solve the next problem, and this is just me speaking here, I think create their own problems. And these fixations on minutia and uh, the idea that we can rewrite how people are and make them into a better image or a holistic ideal is a luxury of intellectualism just because you don't have the barbarians knocking at the door. And it's almost
Right.
it becomes an inevitable progression of the cycle,
Right.
unfortunately.
And it seems to be seeking of like when you have time to relax and think of things and like you said, you have that luxury. It seems like a lot of what people try to do is they seek perfection, right? In everything. They want everything to be extremely perfect, fair, just, all of it. And in doing so, that's often when you see your empire crumbling,
All right, and
right? That's when you don't see the barbarians knocking at your door.
exactly. So let's get to the last stage, the age of decline and collapse. This one is well defined, but it's also very loose at the same time because empires can crumble in a variety of ways. And like you said, Will, at the beginning of the show, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're replaced or erased, only that they lose their preemptive status as the leading power in the world. You think of the current great empire is the West. I would argue in its later stages. The
Yeah.
previous
Led by the
empire,
United States.
led by the United States, the previous empire was without question the British Empire, which was replaced right after the Second World War. Not, and again, the British and the Americans were allied and both espoused Western values. However, the British culture was on decline, whereas the American, ingenuity and muscle and drive was on the ascension.
Right.
Britain replaced Spain in the 1700s. So you can keep going back and back, Ottoman Turks, the Romans, blah blah blah, and there can be different ones in different areas. Just now that we have such a globalized society, it's hard to have room for more than say one, maybe two true empires.
Right. And to stress for anyone who's like, oh, this seems like really doom and gloomy, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that every empire gets destroyed or taken over. Like you said, if you look at Great Britain, it's not a bad place to live still, right? They just simply, they lost control of, they used to possess, I think it was a fifth of the world's population and a quarter of the world's geography. Well, it takes a lot of effort, coordination, and manpower to do that and to maintain that. And eventually, they lost that. However, the homestead, Great Britain, is very much, an acceptable Western free place to live.
All right.
So there are plenty of examples where it's not the empire hasn't crumbled or been taken over by barbarians.
So William, you had a few questions about this one. What's some things you want to just discuss and bounce back and forth on, just to flesh this out a little bit?
Yeah, just before you take it home, well, you alluded to globalization, and that was kind of one of my questions. Is if we try to poke holes in Glub's thesis here in his work, did he miss or underestimate the more recent phenomenon of globalization, or is it simply, or do we simply see an empire fading or growing in other ways? Do we see it via the internet, right, or cryptocurrency, whatever it may be?
Well, empires are fundamentally a group of people with a shared culture, shared values, and it's always been a shared geography. So I don't see technology usurping that. I only seeing it being used as different tools. Instead of ships and spears, you might be using cryptocurrency and whatever else. Uh, Also, like I was saying earlier, where the planet is large, but only so large, with globalization and better means of transportation, you won't be able to have, say, a Mongol empire and a Inca empire at the same time, and say an American empire. So there's going to be fewer empires at
Yeah,
once.
it's much less geographical
Exactly.
nowadays. Yeah, and we told the audience we would talk about this. What age do you think we are currently in?
We're well into the age of decadence, in my opinion. If we look at the West,
Give me
the
some examples. Maybe pop culture.
where do you want to start? All of it. Okay, well, the weakening of religion. There's how many people go to church today?
Hmm.
6. Yeah, that's about it. The welfare state. It's there's almost more incentive not to work than to work. If tax is supposed to motivate, well, the hell are you doing with 50% income tax? And
Yeah, and even worse now with the lockdowns and CERB and all of it. Yeah,
shuttering businesses and UBI and all these methods of financial control. Well, what am I? And we talked a lot about this on our minimum wage episode too. If you have a living wage, say as a minimum wage, call it $20 an hour. Well, why would I go work, study and bust my hump and get into debt to go work for 25 out of high school and go work for 20? Problem is prices are going to rise and there's going to be more people competing for a $20 an hour job now that you can't pay them 10. So you're going to have more unemployment and more dependency. That's a pretty obvious one right there. Frivolity. I mean, a few years ago, the saying of the time was YOLO. That encapsulates frivolity right there. I mean, carpe diem at least is Latin, so it's a little bit classier.
it's classy. But hey, maybe that was the Roman downfall.
Yeah, it's the classy YOLO.
Yeah.
All of the music, materialism speaks for itself.
Yeah, social media, that's a big one for
Social
me.
media. I mean,
Look
what
at me
examples
as
do you want to hit?
Yeah, well, social media is a big one for me. I'd also you talked about the financial aspect, the welfare aspect. That's Alexander Tytler, who I mentioned at the beginning, the Scottish economist from the 1700s. His focus when it came to the cycle of an empire was more focused on that. Is basically once government is established and big enough that it gives gifts to its people, then the people's incentive, no matter what, it just naturally heads towards wanting more gifts and creating and electing governments that give them more gifts until it's no longer sustainable. And then you have complete destruction or downfall of the empire.
And I know we have a very intelligent viewership, and I'm sure they don't need to be reminded this, but government cannot create wealth. Only private citizens can create wealth. A government can only redistribute, mostly very inefficiently.
Yeah, I would say whenever a politician promises jobs or, we'll invest in the green economy, or a big one in the last few years has been we'll invest in infrastructure, right? So we'll pay construction workers and all that to remodel buildings and build new ones and all this stuff. That still doesn't create wealth.
And you still need the
It's
demand for
taxpayer
those
dollars.
buildings.
Yep. Yep. And it's taxpayer dollars.
So, how about you, Will? Do you agree with my espousing that we're well into the age of decadence and knocking on decline and collapse?
I don't think, after a lot of studying this essay and reading it several times, I would absolutely agree with you. We are well into the age of decadence.
All right. So now that it's all doom and gloom and there's no hope for the survival of the West, what do we do? What's our saving grace?
Yeah, let's finish on a positive note, eh? Well, like you said, there are some intelligent investments you can make, whether that's buying property, real estate, and when push comes to shove, we always talk about this: is try to know how to work with your hands a little bit, right? Learn a skill, Learn how to work with wood, plumbing, electricity, cars, whatever it may be. That's a good asset to have as well. Be a doer. Be a doer. That's what I would say too. Like, be a doer. I do find, yes, it's getting harder and harder to be a doer in this kind of society, but it's still something that people long for and people need and people admire, even if they don't recognize that they do.
Very well said. And to give a little bit more concrete examples, I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you said. But when you touch on a skill, have something that brings value to other people that you can do without a whole lot of support. So, like you said, electrical, plumbing, all these trades, you're going to need a few tools, yes, but no matter where you go, you'll have the ability to perform that craft. And it's something that people will need. People won't necessarily need someone who has a master's degree in theology. When the pipes are freezing, who cares what God froze them?
Right.
Like, they're frozen.
Right. Or like a nice movement you're starting to see now that there's a lot of lockdowns going on, is that you have a lot of folks that have kind of gone back to the roots of this country's foundation, and they've gone back to farming, right? So you have a lot of people, even if it's a small backyard, they start to grow their own stuff. They start to get good with knowing their flowers, their plants, their fruits, their veggies. That stuff's important. Again, if something happens, shit hits the fan, if you know how to farm at least a little bit, that's a pretty cool asset to have.
I would also say diversify your income streams. We learned in the last year that government can choose to close or to not to close your place of employment if they deem it essential or not, whether it truly is. And I think every job is essential, because if it was not essential, the free market would naturally get rid of it.
And oftentimes it's there to feed your family. So I think that's pretty essential.
I'd say that's a little important. So diversify your income streams, whether it be through passive income, through dividend stocks, through if you want to go through cryptocurrency, you can do that. Always good to have a little bit of silver and gold. The rental real estate, a house is worth a house. Whatever the dollar value is on it, it's always worth a house. And like I started the podcast by saying, I'm looking into land partially because of this essay, partially because I want to have a refuge. I want to have a place that has value by having trees and wood on it. Also an area to farm if I so choose, a bug out location, and also a place to live down the road that's outside the confines of cities. Because we do know that whenever there's supply chain issues, the first place to get hit is the larger cities.
Yeah, and it's the first places where violence occurs usually too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
cool. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. So thanks a lot for tuning in, guys. Much appreciated. And you can find us on locals.com, a Thought Crimes podcast. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Thought Crimes podcast. So thanks a lot. Cheers.
Cheers.